Hi, everyone. Happy 2024. Welcome back to our monthly webinar series, Conversations on Character and the Common Good. This series is part of Virtues and Vocations, a national forum housed at the Center for Social Concerns at the University of Notre Dame and supported by the Kern Family Foundation. I am Suzanne Shanahan, and I direct the Center for Social Concerns and am host of this series. Virtues and Vocations seeks to foster a community of practice amongst scholars and practitioners across disciplines who are keen to understand how best to cultivate character and moral purpose in higher education and the professions. This webinar is one of the ways we facilitate these conversations. Today's conversation will run till about 12:40, then we'll open it up for your questions. You can submit a question anytime through the Q&A mechanism, and I'll pose them directly. Thus, without further ado, I'd love to welcome today's guest for our conversation, Roosevelt Montás, on freedom, citizenship, and liberal learning. Roosevelt is the director of the Freedom and Citizenship Program and a senior lecturer in American Studies and English at Columbia University. He also served as the former director of Columbia's Center for the Core Curriculum. He was born in the Dominican Republic and moved to the United States as a teenager, where he attended public schools in Queens before attending Columbia College in 1991 through its opportunity programs. In 2003, he completed a PhD in English, also at Columbia. His dissertation, Rethinking America, Abolition, and the Antebellum Transformation of the Discourse of National Identity, won Columbia University's 2004 Bancroft Award. In 2000, he received a Presidential Award for Outstanding Teaching by a graduate student, and in 2008, he received the Dominican Republic's National Youth Prize. He regularly teaches on moral and political philosophy in the Columbia Core Curriculum, as well as seminars in American Studies. He also directs the Center for American Studies Freedom and Citizenship Program, which brings low-income high school students to Columbia's campus to study political theory and then helps them prepare successful applications to college. He speaks widely on history, place, and the future of humanities in higher education. He is also the author of the 2021 Princeton University Press book, Rescuing Socrates: How the Great Books Changed My Life and Why They Matter for a New Generation. Welcome, Roosevelt.
Thank you, Suzanne. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, hoping we can have a fairly informal conversation here over the next hour. And I would love you to start by just jumping in and sharing a bit of how you came to this appreciation for great books, but also how you came to Columbia, what brought you on this current journey.
Great. Thank you. And thank everyone for being here as part of this conversation. It's an honor to be part of this forum and to be in among the distinguished guests that you have had for these conversations. My relationship to education and to liberal education in particular, and to that form of delivering liberal education that's organized around great books, is that relationship is deeply personal. That is, my life has been shaped largely by that experience of education. I was born in the Dominican Republic, in a little mountain town, way out of the kind of urban centers and the, how can I say, like modern life, right? I grew up without many of the amenities that characterize even 20th century living. I didn't have a TV. I didn't have a refrigerator, stove, phone. My parents and people around me didn't formal education was not a thing. Neither of my parents graduated high school. My father didn't even graduate elementary school. And then, like many compatriots, many Dominicans immigrated to the United States. I was 2 days shy of 12 when I came. My dad stayed behind the Dominican Republic. I came to join my mother, who had immigrated a few years earlier. lived in Queens, New York, very sort of marginal existence in the sense that we're poor, ill-equipped to really function in American society and in New York. My mom lost her job shortly after we arrived here. My brother and I ended up living in a basement room in a distant neighborhood, attended public school. But through a series of very sort of lucky breaks, I ended up being admitted to Columbia University after high school graduation, and came to Columbia and experienced its great books for curriculum, a required set of courses for all of its undergraduates. And that was a profoundly transformative experience. That is, it is in through those books, those classrooms, conversations, that I began to sort of locate myself, to get a sense of who I was and who I wanted to be, and a sense of the world around me. It was empowering, illuminating, and it really sort of awakened me to the life of the mind. It awakened me to a way of living, a way of enacting my own self, a way of investigating my own self, that has become sort of central to the person I've turned out to be. I stayed at Columbia past college, as you said in your introduction, and took my PhD here. Started teaching in the core curriculum while I was a graduate student. Eventually became director of the program, did that for 10 years, and have continued to both teach and think deeply about what this thing was that happened to me, and what the place of that kind of education, that experience is in today's university, and importantly, how we can make that kind of experience more available, more accessible to students like me, who were not destined for an elite liberal arts education. Students like me who, statistically speaking, have very few access points to this kind of education, and it's become a very sort of deep commitment of mine to find ways to both encourage this education to happen to begin with in college, but to encourage it to be accessible to students who come from what, roughly speaking, we can call marginalized backgrounds.
Great. When you talk about great books and your own experience, you talk about liberal education. And I heard you once describe it as something often defined by its uselessness, but you also then go on to talk about its transformative, important, and empowering impacts on marginalized communities in particular. Can you just briefly, what is liberal education?
Yeah. So I like to explain what liberal education is by harkening back to its origins. So liberal education is a form of education that is sort of theorized and thought about in antiquity, in ancient Greece. Aristotle is one of the big thinkers about it. I mean, once you know what it is, you can see that Plato is sort of working with the same kind of material. But Athens, where this ideas are first begin to be theorized, is a slave society. It's a democracy. It's a slave democracy, like most democracies have been, including our own, for the first chunk of its history. And in the democratic Athenian city, it was truly democratic. That is, in the sense that it was direct democracy, not in the sense that it included everybody. Obviously, it excluded lots of people. But those who were citizens had a direct participation in the democratic deliberation. That is, they held political office. They took turns holding political office. They debated every law. They voted on the laws. They formulated foreign policy. It was a direct democracy. And liberal education came about as the form of education that would prepare an individual to fulfill these citizenship tasks of self-governance. And if you think about that, what do you need to know to effectively fulfill the role of a democratic citizen, right? A participant in assemblies, on these debates? Well, you need to be You need to have communication skills, and you need to have critical thinking skills, and you need to understand something about history and something about science and something about politics and something about religion. In fact, there is no area of human knowledge that is irrelevant to this whole practice of self-governance, participation in self-governance. So that's what liberal education is. And to this day, it continues to be an education that prepares an individual not for a specific task, not for a specific profession, which is why sometimes it says that it is useless. It prepares them for a life of freedom, for a life of self-governance and self-determination. Now that, of course, if you think about it in a way, that's extremely useful. But what we mean by it being useless is that liberal education is liberated from an instrumental use for any particular task. That is, it is freed from any predetermined end. It is not the terms of contrast in ancient Greece was slave education. In contemporary higher education, the contrasting terms are professional education, technical education, vocational education, applied education. These are the forms of education that give you a particular set of skills to accomplish a particular function or role in a marketplace, in an industry, in society, whereas liberal education does not prepare you specifically for anything, but it lays the foundation for the effective participation in a democratic self-governing society.
Great. So when you look at that kind of education, how do you address concerns about the notion that that's really an elite education? That some individuals, some communities can't afford that kind of experience, that there are more prescient things that they need to deal with in terms of supporting their family, supporting community, etc.
Yeah. It's sort of an old canard, and it's come historically in many different guises. The idea that this form of education is only for the few. And one of the guises that you allude to is to say that because this education has been only for the few, therefore we should exclude the many. But that is completely circular logic, right? That is completely begging the question, taking for granted what one sets out to show. The fact that it has traditionally been denied, except for the few privileged, does not mean that we should continue to enforce those hierarchical patterns of subordination in society. There was some thinker about liberal education that said that the best education for the few is the best education for all. Now, one other thing that feeds into this sort of sense, and it's a widely held sense that, to study literature and art history and philosophy in college is sort of a waste of time, that if you really need to make a living, you need to study something that's practical. Part of what happens with that argument is a conflation between a liberal education and a liberal arts major. And I always need to make that distinction, because a liberal arts major has nothing to do with a liberal education. In fact, a liberal arts major is a specialized major, just like engineering is a specialized major. And one mistake that we have made, and this is pervasive in higher education, is to conflate those two things and to say to be liberal educated is to major in the liberal arts, but it's not. And in fact, we make a tremendous mistake when we say that in order for you to have this kind of broad education where you grapple with philosophical, political, ethical, existential questions in a rigorous intellectual way, that to do that, you must not do something that's practical. What we need to do, in fact, is offer that kind of education to everyone as the foundation of any further specialization. You want to be an engineer, you want to be a computer scientist, you want to be a business person, you want to be a lawyer, you want to be a physician, doesn't matter. Whatever you want to do, it must not come at the expense of this underlying form of education that should be available to every student, to every individual. So yes, a liberal education is in some ways elitist in that it prepares you and it gives you a sense of what is the kind of life that's most worth living, right? So that is what is most excellent in a human life. That's what you investigate in liberal education. So in that sense, it's elitist because you're concerned with the best, with elite, and with questioning judgments about what is best and what is not best. But it's not elitist in the sense that it is an education only appropriate for the socially privileged. In fact, that is just a way of reinforcing hierarchies of domination that we should be committed in higher education to dismantling.
So, as you know, there's another critique of this form of education, which is it's a lot of dead white men, right? That students end up reading. It's the great books don't reflect the lived experiences of the communities you're trying to engage with. How do you address that particular concern?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing you need to do is to acknowledge the fact, to acknowledge that the sort of the great books tradition, just a tradition of learning, and it's not just in sort of the humanities, tradition of scientific inquiry, tradition of mathematical and empirical, philosophical, religious, political, in the past has been dominated by males, um, elite males. That is not just any male, but males that are wealthy and from tremendous social privilege and social capital. If you're talking about sort of the European tradition, there's going to be white. But if you're talking about Chinese antiquity or Indian antiquity or African antiquity, it's going to be males, but not white males. So there is certainly a reality that if you're going to study the historical antecedents of much of the contemporary world, if you're going to be looking at the texts, the works of art, the foundational works, then you're going to be looking at authorship that is not going to be representative of our demographic diversity, nor of the kinds of experiences that we have today. Even if you're a white male today, a white privileged male today, your experiences are not going to be reflected in much of ancient literature. It just doesn't happen. So first, that's the first thing we need to do is we need to acknowledge that. The second thing we need to do is to say that teaches us and illuminates something about the past, about the ways in which certain groups have been excluded and prevented from access to the tools of intellectual production. It is not that women were not smart enough, and it is not that non-white people were not smart enough to participate and in this dialogue. It's that they were denied the tools with which to do it. And part of what we see in the tradition is the challenging of those mechanisms of exclusion. Those mechanisms of exclusion begin to collapse from within, begin to be unjustifiable from within that tradition, and the thing begins to open up. So we look at those things in the past because the only way to access the past is through what we have inherited, and what we have inherited from the past, as far as works, is largely dominated by this elite class. Now, when you get to the 19th century, things begin to open up. When you get to the 20th century, things are open up dramatically. After the Second World War, then you have a sort of pretty much a level playing field as far in as much as you will have the major voices, major writers, major thinkers, major composers, major artists that really represent the diversity that we value today. So when you get to the more kind of recent past, there you have the diversity opening up. The fact that the antiquity doesn't have that diversity is no argument for not engaging it, for not making it accessible to students. And one other thing I want to say about that is that often with that argument comes the idea that somehow Shakespeare or Dante or Plato, Montaigne don't belong to me, that they don't speak to me, that I can only be spoken to from people who share my sort of ethno-cultural background. And that is wrong, that is misguided. It is also condescending and racist. I mean, racist I use loosely, but this idea that somehow my wife, say, who is white, American, Midwestern lady, that she can benefit from Shakespeare and that she should be reading Shakespeare and Dante and Kant and Nietzsche, but not me. I need to be reading Marquez and Borges and Junot Diaz. That is again, it's kind of condescending, offensive, and also reinforces the lack of cultural capital and the hierarchies by which people from marginalized background have been kept marginalized.
Great. So, having sort of eviscerated those two critiques, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, in your own experience, a moment where you personally engaged with a text or took a class or wrote an essay that you began to first realize the transformative power of great books in some way.
Yeah.
Something that, right, sort of really struck you and that sort of lit a fire for you.
Yeah. Well, you know, my life is sort of littered with turning points like that. And the book I wrote, Rescuing Socrates, pauses on four writers that had that kind of life reorienting sort of impact on me. And chronologically, the first of those writers that I encountered was Plato. And I did so quite accidentally when I was a sophomore in high school, living in Queens with a single mother. Um, People from next door threw out a bunch of books, beautiful. Some of them were beautiful, bound, gilded, edged pages. And I went and grabbed a few volumes there. One of them was this book by Plato, recording the last days of Socrates. So it had a series of dialogues. If you know the Platonic canon, those dialogues are the Euthyphro and the Apology, the Credo, and the Phaedo. Sort of record the last days of Socrates. And I started reading them. My English wasn't that good, but those books are incredibly accessible. I mean, even for a high school student. And here I see this old man, Socrates, who is brought to trial. And I didn't know. I mean, I did not know what happens at the end, right? I did not know that Socrates was going to be convicted. I did not know that he was going to be executed. I did not know the kind of defense he was going to make, what Socrates was about. I'm just reading this from the cold, and it's kind of a gripping story. And I see this old man defending the idea of free inquiry and of asking questions and saying, I cannot stop this activity of searching after the truth, even if you threaten me with death. Even if you say we're going to let you off the hook now, we're going to free you, but you have to stop asking questions. You have to stop this investigation. He says, no, I cannot stop that investigation. And you know, in my book, I tell the story about a high school teacher who saw me reading this book and came and engaged me and became a kind of guide, a mentor, working through this dialogues. And that thing sort of exploded in my mind because it gave me a window into a form of life, into a way of living where my sort of my material deprivations, I was poor. I mean, I knew that. But where my material deprivations were not insurmountable impediments to a certain kind of life that had to do with how I oriented myself to investigating the most fundamental questions of life. I mean, suddenly a door opened up for me, say, you know, I can live this kind of life and no one can stop me. So, you know, that was the beginning. And, you know, that same teacher schemed my attending Columbia, where he knew that I would be completely immersed in the kind of thing that that book had had sparked for me.
So, your neighbor's getting rid of books. You happen onto them. Um, what does your mother and brother think of this? Would they have picked them up and read them in the same way? Do you think you were somehow distinctive at that moment to sort of find a beautifully bound book and say, "Oh, I'm going to read Plato"?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I was in some ways I was distinctive, and in some ways I was not. And this is one of the things that I've tried to understand in part through that book, thinking about my childhood and thinking about the choices I've made and the things that sort of encouraged me to make the choices I made. Um, my brother and I, so as you alluded, I have an older brother. We came here together, same parents. Um, we both went to college. We're the only two in a pretty extended family that went to college. I think we both had a kind of intellectual flame burning, and that came in large part from our father. Where we grew up, our father was, even though had no formal education, just fourth grade education, lived a very politically engaged life. He was involved in opposition to a strong man, right wing government in the Dominican Republic. He spent time in jail. He organized. So we grew up in this kind of engaged with ideas, engaged in a kind of political struggle that I think gave us, both my brother and I, a sense that ideas mattered, and a sense that there was a larger world beyond our immediate domestic concerns. So I think we brought that attitude to the United States. So we both ended up pursuing, my brother and I, in different ways, careers that are quite intellectual. My brother's a writer, and works at a university, even though he does not work as an academic at the university. His sort of life is very intellectual. My dear mother, who has no education and doesn't have the same kind of intellectual curiosities that our father instilled in us, what she has had is a sense of encouragement and a kind of respect for the choices my brother and I have been making. I mean, even to this day, my mother, who still lives in Queens, has very little understanding of what it is that I do for a living, has very little understanding of the world in which I live. She has not read the book that I wrote nor anything that I have written, because she doesn't speak English. But what she recognized was that we were doing something that we felt was important and we were committed to and working hard at. So she, she feels very proud of me, and she expresses that in all kinds of ways. And she knows that I have achieved important things in my life. But her attitude has always been of support and love for what we do, without understanding really what it is that I and my brother do.
Great. There are a couple places in recent things you've written that speak very directly to the relationship between a liberal education and democracy. And I think you sort of echoed one of them. Just a brief quote when you were making your sort of response to critiques. And one of the pieces, called "Great Books Are Still Great," the last line is something like, "It is also the most valuable contribution they make to a democratic society." And you talk about the access of this cultural wealth to underprivileged communities. Can you talk a little bit about, in a more granular way, maybe using an example from how you teach, how you get from those texts to support for democracy, defense of democracy, enacting democracy, embodying democracy, however you want to frame it?
Yeah, great. I think one way to talk about it is through a course I teach every summer to high school students who are going into their senior year. So high school students have finished their junior year in mainly public schools in New York City. And then that summer, before they start their senior year, we bring them to campus. These are high school students who are all from low-income families and who are the first in their families who wish to go to college. We bring them to Columbia for a month. They live on campus. They eat in the dining halls. They take a seminar with Columbia faculty, and me being one of them, and some other colleagues who are college faculty members. And we study the text that was so transformative to me in high school, the Apology of Socrates, and those dialogues. We read Aristotle, we read Thucydides, we read the social contract theories, Locke, Hobbes, Rousseau. We read texts from the American Revolution, Jefferson and Lincoln, and we spend the last portion of the class thinking about civil rights in the United States. And we read we read Martin Luther King, and we read James Baldwin. And I see something happening to these students through that study of those texts. And of course, it's in a kind of a liberal education. The idea is to see if we can understand the ideas, debates, and arguments that these writers are having. See if they resonate with us. See if they have any relevance into the way that we understand our own contemporary reality. See what they say about human nature, about the nature of politics, about the nature of knowledge, about the nature of consensus. See if those things resonate with our own experience, and what places do we see our views confirmed, what places we see our views challenged, etc. It's this deep conversations we have. And I see something happen to those students over the course of that month that they're here. And one way to put it is that they often come, first of all, never having been in a class where their opinion matters, where they are taken to have the stature and the standing to weigh in on matters of real human consequence. It's one thing that happens. They've also have had experiences in their lives where they see themselves as beings to whom things happen. That is, as individuals who are subject, sometimes victims of forces that they can't control, can't understand, can't intervene on. And by the time those students leave, 4 weeks later, they're thinking and talking as if they are people whose opinion matters, as if they are people who can change their reality, as if they have the stature and the tools to intervene in the debates and questions that determine the shape of our society. They are empowered with a sense of agency and with a sense of insight. I always say, that can you imagine what it does for a high school student from a low income first gen to college background to read Aristotle and understand Aristotle and disagree with Aristotle? This is not a trivial thing. The way that they read newspapers, the way that they look at the news, the way that they engage with their public officials, the way that they think about college, the way that they relate to the problems in their communities, all of that becomes transformed by this kind of education that is, useless. It's a kind of education simply in what it means to be a human being and a citizen of a free society. Um, it is in this way that liberal education is absolutely critical for democracy. And it is in this way that we will never attain our potential and realize the dream of American democracy unless we take liberal education for all seriously. The elite of America have been having liberal education for hundreds of years. The non-elite of the United States have not had access to that. And our current political crisis, the fact that we today have find ourselves as a society unable to navigate, to digest, to metabolize the democratic life and the problems that emerge to us is one way that you can name that sort of political crisis that we're in. It's a failure of liberal education in our population. That is, we have not educated a population with the tools to metabolize the discursive challenges in disinformation and propaganda, in the crisis of institutions that we are facing. We have not equipped the brunt of the population with the tools to work through that. So we are facing a kind of logjam in our politics.
Right. So I want to talk about the state of democracy in higher education in a little bit. I'd love to dig down a bit more on this program. So where did this program come from? What was the idea? Right?
Yeah.
How did you get involved?
Yeah. I mean, we've now been doing this program. This coming summer will be our 14th year. So we are beginning the recruitment process now in high schools that we work with to recruit our class. It's called the Freedom and Citizenship Program. I'm the director of that program. I helped started 15 years ago now I was director of the Center for the Core Curriculum at the time and partnered with the Center for American Studies where I taught, and with a service organization on campus called the Double Discovery Center that works with this population of students. It used to be an upward bound program with federal funds dedicated to working with low income first gen to college students. And we, I had my own personal experience and I knew what this education did for me. And when I walk out of the Columbia campus and go to my house in Washington Heights or go visit my mother in Queens, I am literally surrounded by students who are just like me, in that many of them are immigrants, their parents didn't go to college, they are low income, and they are facing challenges in the world around them that they, like I did, do not have the tools to encounter. And I wondered, if we give those students an opening, if we draw a path for them, illuminate that path and put them at the beginning steps, will they go in that direction? Will they find this kind of education transformative and empowering? So one summer we applied for a grant, me and some colleagues applied for a grant to bring 15 of those students from the Double Discovery Center, the Upward Bound program at Columbia, for this kind of experience. And I designed the syllabus and we sort of organized ourselves, so housed them in dormitories, etc. And it was extraordinary what happened. I mean, the thing that I was testifying to before was evident from that first class. So we really committed to this program. We've raised money for it. It's obviously free for the students. We don't charge them anything. In fact, we give them a little stipend. We after the summer that they're here during their senior year, we help them get into college. So we match them with a college mentor that will sort of walk them through the college application. Virtually all of our students go to college. We have a 99 point something percent placement rate into four-year colleges of all kinds. So we saw the potential of the program. We feel that Colombia and we have a certain responsibility to the community in which we live, and this is one way of discharging that responsibility. So I mean, I can talk a lot about this program because one of the exciting things that we've begun to do from the beginning, the question of scalability came to my mind, right? Okay, so we can have an impact on this 15 students, but as a drop in the bucket. So one thing we do, we've grown the program, so we now have 45 students every summer, but that's still not a big dent in the problem. But it had always been my ambition that we could spur other universities to do things like what we're doing. So I didn't want to grow the Columbia program into a gigantic summer academy, but I wanted NYU and City College and Hunter and Fordham and Baruch to start their own programs, and we've made some really exciting progress in that. We partnered with the Teagle Foundation, who has been making grants to sort of replicate our program. We now have 30 plus of those programs all over the country. Last 2 weeks ago, we had our first gathering. We had it at Yale. Yale was one of the early adopters, so they started a program modeled on ours very early on. So 2 weeks ago, we had a gathering there of faculty and directors of these programs from all over the country. And anyway, it's a very exciting initiative, and we are looking and expecting to grow even bigger this network.
That's fantastic. Yeah, just an amazing, amazing project. Um, what's your favorite piece to teach that group? What do you have the most fun with, the most engagement with? Like what energizes
Yeah,
you the most
yeah.
particular group?
It may be because of my own history with the text, but the first text that we do, we do the Euthyphro, and then the Apology and the Credo of Plato, which again tell the story of Socrates. That is a thing I love to teach. I love to walk students through those arguments, see what they think about this argument, see the kinds of, every teacher has seen this when you see like a light bulb lighten up in somebody's brain, you can see it in their face. Seeing that with the students, it's always just a remarkable thing, and I love doing it and just relish that. At the end of the seminar, I often ask students to tell me what their favorite text was or class discussion, and one consistent and surprising hit in the syllabus that I teach is Hobbes' Leviathan, a very difficult text. For one thing, is the first text that they read not in translation, so they actually read the original 17th century English. So it's very hard, just syntactically and semantically. But working through those ideas, it's very exciting, and it often, why was this text? And it's the way in which that text speaks of human nature and speaks about a kind of a state of war, of all against all, competition, drive for power. It so often confirms aspects of the students' lives, and it's always kind of revealing to me that many of them say, Hobbes got it right. This is the way that the world works out there. And in some way, is a lamentable reality of their lives, that the conditions under which what they see when they look at the political world around them it's so like what they read in Hobbes. In another way, it's a very, very powerful thing that they can read that text and connect with it at that kind of personal level.
No, that's extraordinary. And I think it sort of cues the next kind of question. You've talked about the partisan weaponization of curricula, right? And we are in a particular moment of a crisis of democracy, if you will, a crisis of higher education. Um, how do you see liberal education as the way forward, right? How do students who are most taken by Hobbes understand and develop abilities to create a different alternative in a democratic society?
Yeah, liberal education in the American system is in trouble. There are a lot of ways in which you can name this. One obvious sort of measure is that students are fleeing humanities courses and liberal arts courses, not majoring in them, and fact there are no jobs. Every year, every Columbia, but every major institution is graduating lots of PhDs in the humanities who can't find jobs in academia because the disciplines are shrinking. So there are a lot of ways in which you can name this problem, but liberal education is in trouble, and part of that trouble is that liberal education has been sort of strangled in the curriculum by specialized study, what I was talking about before, sort of specialized disciplinary study, instead of truly liberal education. So students go to college, and the thing that they encounter in many of their liberal arts classes or in their general education requirements doesn't really address the deep concerns and thinking and the kinds of human questions that a liberal education is really aimed at addressing. So liberal education is in trouble in higher education. One of the responses that we are seeing is for various politically motivated agendas to try to take over the curriculum. Most recently, it's been from the conservative end. Many politicians, few educators, but many politicians who have come to see a traditional liberal arts curriculum as a kind of antidote to wokefulness, as a kind of anti-woke curriculum. Replicating, by the way, an attitude that one has seen in academia for a long time, which is many academics seeing the humanities as sort of the opposite of that, seeing the humanities as a way of turning students into social activists, into social justice warriors. Both of these approaches that try to instrumentalize liberal education for ideological purposes, I think are misguided and are deepening the crisis in higher education about in liberal education in our colleges and universities. Liberal education cannot be delivered as a vehicle to take our students to any ideologically predetermined position. A liberal education will not make you liberal politically, and it will not make you conservative politically. A liberal education will raise the fundamental questions behind liberalism and conservatism and give you clarity about how to think through those issues. And you're going to end up where you're going to end up. And I've been doing this a long time. Some students end up being conservative, some students end up being liberal, and neither of those are because the kind of education that they got, if we're talking about a real liberal education. But every liberally educated person, whether they're conservative or liberal, is going to end up with the tools for democratic self-governance. They are going to end up with the discursive, intellectual, and character capacities to navigate difference and to engage in the kind of deliberative decision-making that produces a free society. So liberal education is the thing that we in higher education can contribute to our democratic crisis. And our democratic crisis, as I alluded before, you can't blame universities for it. I do not blame universities for it, but I do blame universities for not contributing what they should contribute to our democratic culture. And whichever way if we are able to get through this crisis, democratic crisis that we are experiencing, part of that answer is going to be a renewed attention to liberal education. That is a form of education that prepares students for democratic deliberation and democratic life.
That's fantastic. And I think you indirectly answered our first question, which was about recent attacks on higher education and liberal education. So let me turn to the next one. What would you say to those that say the cost of college education is so high that it is simply too expensive and that it is unfair to require people to pay for core courses in liberal learning if they are really seeking a necessary professional credential? Or to teachers who say it's too costly in terms of time, so much else needs covering. Do we need to make changes to make this kind of education more affordable in terms of time or money?
Yeah, great. That's a great question. I mean, there is no justification for the cost of education, higher education now. That is, it is scandalous that it is. Although I should say that what an education actually costs is not a straightforward matter. Um, you know, take my own case, and I have students like this all the time. I was poor. I went to a very, very expensive institution, and I paid almost nothing. Because if you are poor and you go to a rich institution, there is very generous financial aid. So it's not the case that there isn't a straightforward relationship uh, between the cost of a place and sort of the sticker price of a university education and what you as a low-income person will pay. It varies dramatically. That's not to justify, because if you are then middle class, the middle class really gets the short end of the stick here. The middle, if you're super wealthy in some way, doesn't matter as much because you can afford it. Maybe you'll take one fewer vacation or something, or the trust fund will not be as big. Uh, if you're very wealthy, some way you can afford it. If you're middle class, then that's where we have a big problem, where people feel that education is so expensive that they have to look at it simply as a transaction where I'm going to invest, where I am, and then I expect a rate of return, and every credit that I earn, which costs me a fortune, has to deliver an economic payoff. That, it is, if you stand back and look at it, that we think today that it is acceptable, that it's okay for a student to come out of a 4-year education with tens of thousands of dollars in debt. That is preposterous. That we think that it's okay, that it's normal, that is what it's going to be the expectation, that you're going to come out with a huge debt burden just for getting a higher education. So we need to fix that. We need to, and that's a big problem. It's not just a university problem. It's a social, it's a political problem. That I I think it's indefensible. We need to find ways to make higher education accessible to everyone, including middle class families, without a huge indebtedness. That is, we need to come to recognize higher education as a public good, not as a private good. And because it is a public good, it requires public investment in it. I mean, we're having a similar debate in healthcare. Um, that the idea that healthcare is something that people just as individuals should bear the full burden of the cost, it's untenable. We need to find ways to make healthcare affordable for people. Now, we have to distinguish that between, is it worth young people's time to study the liberal arts and to take this seriously? Because there we have to ask the prior question, what is the purpose of an education? And what is the purpose of college? And if you think that the purpose of college is merely to equip you to do a job and earn money, then we don't need to talk anymore. Sure, forget liberal education. But if you think that college should do something beyond that college education involves something beyond the development of market skills, that it involves the cultivation of particular sorts of human beings, particular kinds of skills that have to do with the fact that we are all in the same existential and political reality, and that we are involved in a project, in a collective project of making our future. We are involved in a collective project of building a world. If you think that college education should go beyond merely equipping students to do a job and earn a living, then we're talking about liberal education. Now, I believe that higher education needs to do this, that is in the soul of higher education, to provide not just a practical, marketable education, to provide a deep education for freedom. So I do think that liberal education belongs centrally in the university, but that does require recognition that it is a public good that requires public investment.
Great, that's fantastic. One question that relates to this as we turn to wrapping up, can you provide a must-reading list for a freshman in a public high school to work over their 4-year high school experience? Or maybe just something you, besides Plato, anything else you're just like, this is a must-read?
Wow. A complicated question, in part because a liberal education is not just reading great books. A liberal education involves conversation, involves a group of people who are engaged in an intellectual task with a skilled teacher and a provocative text. So it's not just about the reading list. But I can say some general things about the kinds of readings that I think a high school student beginning from the first year would benefit from and find meaningful. Again, the idea is not just to read this, but to find a group of people with whom you can read and discuss this. But I would say favor old texts. That is, I mean, old texts are often less interesting, less engaging, less riveting, less of a patient that require greater effort. But they also, there's this line in Nietzsche where it says that it is good sometimes to swim out into the ocean of archaic ideas, and from that look out into the shore of the present. Swim out into these archaic ideas, and from there take a look at where you are. So ancient texts, Western and non-Western, the Iliad, but also the Mahabharata, Plato, but also Lao Tzu. Doesn't need to be just Western. Another thing that I would say is that there are, if you're American, if we're talking about an American high school student, there are things about the particular political cultural development of this country that are very much worth the attention of every high school student. Things like the Declaration of Independence, and the Constitution and the Federalist Papers, and great American literature like Emerson and Melville and Thoreau and Whitman. These are sort of earlier works. These are 19th century works that I'm talking about, but those works have a power of illuminating and framing contemporary reality for Americans that I think is quite essential in a high school education. And many of these texts are accessible to high school students, and they're not beyond their capacities to read. So those are some thoughts, but I like to get people to think away from the reading list, because that's important, but it's easy to talk about because you can point to it and you can name it, but that's only one ingredient in what needs to happen to have a liberal education.
So just a final super quick question as we wrap up. I think of you as sort of a real evangelist for liberal education and a true believer. Have you ever had a moment of doubt
I
about
have, yeah,
education?
I have not had a moment of doubt about the value of this education. I have had moments of doubt about whether we will be able to bring American higher education to fulfill its mission of providing this kind of education broadly to the mass population. I mean, something that we're seeing right now is that this kind of education is under attack from the right and from the left, and it's under pressure institutionally, professionally, kind of culturally. And I fear, and sometimes I feel my hopes are diminished sometimes. So I'm a pretty optimistic person, but I fear that we may be drifting, the big danger is that we're drifting to a situation in which liberal education becomes again the province of a privileged well-resourced elite with technical, vocational, pre-professional education, much of it online for everybody else. I guarantee you, the wealthy, the privileged, the people rich in cultural capital are going to continue to seek and pay for a liberal education for their children. What we risk is that liberal education becomes just that, which will be a way of reversing and reversing progress we have made in inequality and entrenching the hierarchies of privilege and domination that have marred our history.
Thank you for that. And I know you have to dash off to class and continue this important work. So thank you so much for joining us this lunch hour. And to everybody else who joined us, please visit with us again on Monday, February 26th for Hope and Peril in American Medicine with Ricardo Nuila. So thank you. That was just fantastic. Really
Thank you,
appreciate it.
Suzanne. It's a
Have a
pleasure.
great afternoon.